Round 14 of the URC, and it's beginning to feel like last chance saloon for some teams looking to make a run to the playoffs. My name is Mark. Let's talk rugby. Not many games left now in the regular season for those teams who, find themselves outside the playoff spots to, really get their act together and potentially make a run to the playoffs. We got a full set of fixtures this weekend, and it feels like certain teams are making the right moves and other teams are being left behind. So we're just going to go through each of the matchups, look at the recent form as usual, and then make a prediction. So we got 3 games on Friday. The first of those is Hollywoodbets Sharks versus Cardiff Rugby. That is a 5 p.m. kickoff or 6 p.m. here in Spain. As always, check your local listings. This is at Hollywoodbets Kings Park. And we got Cardiff at the moment in 5th place. The Sharks are down in 11th, but the Sharks actually recently in better form. They've won 4 of their last 7. Cardiff won 3 of their last 7. And the Sharks, their sequence, they had a win against the Bulls, then they lost against the Lions, beat the Stormers, beat them again, so back-to-back wins against the Stormers, then they lose against the Lions, lose against the Bulls, and then last week they beat a pretty abject Munster 45 points to 0. Cardiff, their run, lost against the Scarlets, then a win against Dragons, then lost against the Ospreys, win against Benetton. They lost against Ulster, then they win against Leinster, and then they lost against the Bulls. And that Bulls, I think it was 40 points to 7 in that one. They actually scored the first try, but that's about all they did in the game. But just one bit of optimism, for Cardiff fans, I guess, is that they've been going loss, win, loss, win, loss, win. Last time was a loss, so obviously this one is going to be a win if you apply that logic. It's not the best of logic though to be relying on, I don't think, in this one. And hopefully you want to see a better performance in Cardiff in this one, because they weren't great last week, in terms of the overall game. Sharks are brilliant though, but the Sharks kind of find it hard, the URC, to put really good back-to-back performances together. So, there definitely is a chance there for Cardiff to get something out of the game. And if they did, it could be, a major thing for them as well, just in terms of solidifying a place there in the top 6 as well, because there are teams likes of the Lions and the Bulls hunting down those top 6 who had a bit of a gap on the rest of the league, but not anymore. Like they're a point or 2 behind 6th place Munster at the minute. So I said before, Cardiff went for their South African tour, that it really felt like they needed to get something out of it. They haven't got anything so far, so I think maybe in this one we will see better performance from them. Maybe the Sharks dropping off a little bit. I do expect the Sharks to win, but maybe Cardiff are going to get a losing bonus point. So I'm going to go for a Sharks win, but for the score to be narrower compared to how much Sharks won by last week and how much Cardiff lost by last week as well. Okay, so on to the next one then. We have Glasgow Warriors versus Benetton. This is a 7:45 kickoff. Again, that's Ireland UK time. It's at Scotstoun Stadium. And this feels like a big game for Glasgow. Not in that, Benetton have been brilliant or anything recently, but more the fact that, Glasgow after this game have a pretty tough run in, and the moment they're sitting top of the league, they beat Leinster last week, everything looking rosy, but that tough run in could allow other teams to maybe close that gap. So I think a bonus point win here is almost a must for Glasgow, just to give themselves that little bit of breathing room. I do expect them to finish top 2 in the table. Like at the moment, they're still my favourites to finish as number 1 seeds, but that tough run in, if they don't take too many points from it, other teams, the likes of the Stormers, who have been rejuvenated recently, could actually eat into that lead. So it's very important for them, I think, not just to get a win here, but to make sure to get the bonus point win. I think they have the wherewithal to do that. And as I said, Benetton have been great shakes. But let's have a look at the team's form and why I'm kind of saying that. So Glasgow, they've won 6 of the last 7. Benetton have won 3 of the last 7. They've got 2 draws in there as well. So the Glasgow run, they beat Edinburgh back to back, so 2 wins there. Then they beat Zebre, and then Zebre again, so back to back wins again. Then they beat Munster, shock loss against Connacht, and then they bounced back with that comprehensive win against Leinster. Benetton, by contrast, they had back-to-back wins against Zebre. Then they lose to Edinburgh and Cardiff, draws against the Scarlets and Dragons, and then they beat Ospreys last time out. So at least on the back of a win, but they haven't been great on the road this year. And that's one of the things that kind of set Benetton apart in the last maybe 2 or 3 seasons, was the fact that they weren't just good at home, they were competitive on the road. We haven't really seen that from them this year, certainly not too much. And because of that, I'm predicting Glasgow win. I think, Glasgow are just looking, so good. Like that Connacht result aside, for me, they've looked the best team in the league, and I think it's going to be a bonus point win for them. On to then the third Friday night game, and it's Leinster versus Scarlets. This is 7:45 kickoff at the Aviva Stadium, and this already feels like for Leinster a must win, because they've had a few slip ups recently. They got absolutely tanked by Glasgow as well. Very costly double yellow card period for them. They picked a strong side, considering obviously had a lot of players missing still. But you look at if you looked at Leinster, or not even just look at the Leinster players up there and imagine that they played for another team in the league, and they were able to have people like Ronan Kelleher, Robert Slimani, Orgy Sneyman, Jack Conan, Prendergast, Hugo Keenan, Rico Ioane, tons of talent in there. But for whatever reason, the Leinster second team just aren't doing it this year. It'd be interesting to see how many of those Irish players come back into the setup. I imagine there will be more of them this week, simply because they've had the week off now after the Six Nations. Leinster will want to get them back into their systems, I think, with Champions Cup coming up, etc. And it feels like a perfect opportunity at home in the Aviva. Well, not at home, Aviva is kind of their second home, would be but certainly home in Dublin, and on the back of 2 defeats on the bounce as well, having they clawed their way up the table up to second place, and then as soon as they got there, then they fell away again. So they've almost got to do it all over again. And if they didn't win this one, you'd worry about them. I don't think missing out on the playoffs, but certainly in terms of being able to make a run to, first of all, secure a home quarterfinal and possibly a home semi-final if they get that far. I'm not sure, depending on how far they go in Europe, if they're picking the second team in the knockouts of the URC, home or away, like I'd be worried about them making any progress at all past the quarterfinal and that. So that's another story, though. That's a couple of months away at the minute. But let's have a look at the form. So as I said, Leinster 5 wins on the bounce. So it was Ulster, then Munster, Connacht again, and then Edinburgh. Then lost against Cardiff, and then that damaging loss against Glasgow last week. Scarlets, they've won 2 of the last 7. They got a draw in there as well. So they lost against Ospreys, and then Dragons. Then they beat Ulster. They drew against Benetton, lost to Edinburgh, lost to Connacht, and then last week then they beat Zebre. And, decent win against Zebre, and it'll give them a bit of confidence, I think. And the fact that, you look at Leinster, they're not the all-conquering team that we're used to seeing from them, especially when they have to dip into the wider squad this season. Players who, the likes of, Scott Penny, etc., and we talked about all the other players who were available last week as well. For whatever reason, not hitting the heights that they were in previous seasons, and it feels like the coaches need to get into that group and instill some belief in them, and get them back to winning ways. So certainly I think an opportunity for Cardiff, but I do think Leinster will have more of Ireland's Triple Crown winning players back and available for them, and they will be put in there as well. They probably have a fairly strong bench if they maybe need to go there to kind of pull away or to rescue the game. But yeah, I do expect a Leinster win out of that one. But yeah, Leinster 4th place, Scarlets in 14th, and Scarlets one of those teams that I feel like if they do lose this one, as I'm predicting, that will be them done in terms of making the playoffs. I think by the end of this weekend, it'll have, like, if they lose, they'll have 4 games left, and let's say even that, I expect one of the Bulls or Connacht to probably win this weekend, but even if they don't, still having to make up 14 or 15 points in 4 games, that's a bit too much, I think. So for them, I think for both teams it feels like a must-win game, but I think Leinster are definitely going to deliver. Next then, we move on to the Saturday games. So we've got Vodacom Bulls versus Munster, and another reason why I think that target for the Scarlets is going to be too much for them after these weekends, because Bulls at home, against a Munster team who were very abject last week against the Sharks. You expect some kind of response from Munster, but we'll have to see. But this one, Bulls versus Munster, it's a 12 o'clock kickoff. Again, Ireland UK times is at Loftus Versfeld. And yeah, looking at the form, Bulls certainly the better in recent times. They've won 4 of the last 7. Munster, 3 of the last 7. But the Bulls have won 4 of the last 5 compared to just 2 for Munster. So yeah, definitely the better form team. And they've also got the carrot of, if they can beat Munster with a bonus point and denied Munster any kind of points out of the game, then the Bulls will leapfrog them as well. So, that again, talking about the fact that the likes of Munster, Cardiff and the rest of the top 6 had that nice 8 to 10 point gap on the team in 7th place, but the Lions and the Bulls and actually Connacht as well have hunted them down and made it a much closer affair now. And if we look at the sequences, so the Bulls they lost the Sharks, then lost the Stormers, then they beat Edinburgh, they beat the Lions, they beat the Sharks, they lost the Stormers, and then they beat Cardiff last week, 40 points to 7. Munster then in their sequence, win against the Ospreys, then back-to-back losses against Leinster and then Ulster. Then they beat Dragons, lost against Glasgow, they beat Zebre, and then they lost to the Sharks last week, 45 points to nil. So, looking at the teams that they beat, like Zebre, Dragons, and Ospreys, Ospreys the only team who've been in okay form recently, really. Any kind of form teams that they come up against, they've lost to. And as I said, Bulls, one of the form teams recently in the league as well. So, that really does feel like a big ask for Munster. I do expect, though, having getting beaten 45-0, that there's going to be some kind of response from them. And we have seen teams before where they take a heavy defeat in the first game of South Africa and then they come back and somehow they scrape some kind of win out of it. So certainly that is a possibility for Munster. But I'm wearing the Bulls shirt for a reason. I'm Irish. I want Munster to win, but I'm predicting the Bulls win, sadly, in this one, and that's nothing against the Bulls. It's just I think the same for South African fans. It depends, I guess, because some South African fans probably would rather that the rival South African teams lost. But certainly for me, I put the Irish teams first in my mind in terms of who I'm going to cheer for. But Bulls, one of my favourite teams still in the league. And, it's good to see them coming back. Not necessarily at the expense of Irish teams, but if that happens, it happens. But yeah, I'm predicting Bulls win in that one. Okay, on to the next game then, and it is Connacht versus Ospreys. This one is a 2:15 kickoff. Not sure why, the kind of the staggering of the kickoffs is a bit weird, but this at the Dexcom Stadium. And Connacht, like the Bulls, one of the four teams, at least recently, in the league. Certainly you wouldn't say it in terms of the whole season, but Connacht have certainly found a fairly decent run of form recently. So, and if we look at that form, they're playing against an Ospreys team who kind of similarly have been in decent form, recently. You have to remember earlier on the season, Ospreys were bottom of the league. They clawed their way out of there. They then had a bit of a relapse. And then they've gone on a run recently that's seen them rise up that table from, 14th place, I think it was, all the way up to 10th place, where they're on the cusp of potentially getting into those playoff spots. But they have Connacht, who are in 9th place and 6 points ahead of them in the way. And again, I wouldn't say for Ospreys that this is the last chance saloon, because they're close enough. They obviously a couple of seasons ago as well did their miracle 2% or where it was 3% back-to-back wins in the last couple of rounds to make the playoffs as well. So you don't write the Ospreys off until it's mathematically done. But at the same time, with a rival team who are basically the next team up in the league from you, and you're already 6 points behind them, you don't want to be losing to them and have that gap grow to 10, 11 points. So it does feel, in that sense at least, like a must win for Ospreys. They're going to stay in that mix, because otherwise they are going to have to go on another big run and potentially, win their last 4 games. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that they could do that, but obviously they'd rather get the win here and give themselves a little bit of wiggle room in terms of maybe, winning 3 of the last 4 or something like that to qualify. So yeah, it feels like a big game for both teams. If we look at the form then, so Connacht in the last 7 started with 3 losses on the bounce, where we were kind of wondering, what's gone on? Like, Connacht are inconsistent. and it felt like, a little bit maybe Stuart Lancaster trying to get his way of playing in there and instill some belief, and not really working at the time, which you kind of expect, with new coaches. It doesn't happen overnight. We've seen with with Murphy up at Ulster that it's taken the guts of 2 seasons for him to really get his team, playing well and being properly competitive in this league. But in that sequence, they did lose to that Ulster team by 5 points. Then shipped a heavy loss against Leinster, and then a closer loss against Leinster after that. Then they go on their winning streak, so they beat Zebre, then they beat Glasgow. That was, a brilliant performance from them. They backed it up then by beating Scarlets, and then last week then they went and they beat Ulster. So that was the first Interpro win. So for those who aren't familiar with it, Interpro is basically what we call the Irish derbies in Ireland. So the first Interpro since the beginning of January 2024, so more than 2 years since they'd won one of those games. And they go to Ulster, one of the 4 teams in the league, who were up there looking to get themselves up to potentially second place in the league by winning that game, and Connacht delivering a brilliant result there, and that's going to be a massive boost for them. But the thing now is, with Connacht's history of being inconsistent, can they, from that high of beating Ulster, can they now back it up and perform at home as well? Or are we going to see return to the old Connacht ways of brilliant performance followed by, a not very inspiring performance and losing a game that maybe people would expect them to win? But then we have Ospreys on the other side of the equation. So they, in their sequence, lost to Munster, then they had back-to-back wins, so they beat Scarlets and then Cardiff. Then they drew against the Lions, then another couple of wins, Dragons, and then Ulster. So both these teams have beaten Ulster in the last couple of rounds. And then that loss against Benetton away by 12 points. And I think that's the thing as well when you're looking at these 2 teams, is the fact that Ospreys are away from home, Connacht are at home, and when you're one of those teams where you've had decent form, but you've also had an inconsistent season, just being at home can be enough to tip the scales for you. And I'm going to go with that. I'm going to go for a Connacht win in that one. Now we're on to the next game, and it is the Lions versus Dragons. This one is a 2:30 kickoff. So as I said, Connacht Ospreys starting at 2:15, and this one's starting at 2:30, and this is at Ellis Park. And the Lions have talked about it, where they're kind of like Jekyll and Hyde. Like, put them in Europe, and they've been pretty much terrible most of the year, and then put them in a game with South Africa, it doesn't matter where it's home or away, and they've been pretty decent, they've been pretty good. And that's not good for the Dragons, unfortunately. And at the minute we're talking about the Lions in 7th place. They that recent form has catapulted them right up into the playoff spots. They're 1 point behind Munster. So if, as expected, Munster lose this weekend, then the Lions could, potentially this weekend, the Lions could move up 2 or 3 spots and be right up there, embedded in those top 6 then. And then it's about riding it out to actually make the playoffs, because we've seen the Lions come close before and then fall away right at the death. So let's see how they deal with this one. The Dragons, they're in 15th place. Not really in danger, I think, of being caught by Zebre, because an 8-point gap there. They are, 1 point behind Scarlets, who were just above them, 3 points behind Edinburgh, and then it's 8 points jumped in to Benetton. So realistically, I think for Dragons is trying to win that little mini battle little mini league from 13th down to 15th, and see if they can finish as high up the table as possible. They've had some decent performances and good results recently as well, but they haven't really put a run together. And so now 5 games left in the season, you have to say, kind of like the Scarlets, that certainly with an amazing run, they could make the playoffs. It's unlikely though. So more what you're concentrating on is let's get some good results that we can build on for next season. So contrasting kind of ambitions, I would say, from both of these teams. Dragons would obviously love to get something out of a game down in South Africa. It would give them a massive boost to confidence. But as I said, the Lions in South Africa really are different beasts. But let's look at the form. So Lions, they've won 4 of the last 7 with a draw in there as well. Dragons have won 2 of the last 7 with a draw for them. So the Lions lost against the Stormers, then they beat the Sharks, they drew against Ospreys, lose to the Bulls, and then 3 wins on the bounce. Sharks, Stormers, and then Edinburgh. And all those games happening in South Africa. And then the Dragons, then they beat Connacht, lose to Cardiff, then they beat Scarlets, then losses against Munster and Ospreys, draw against Benetton, and then they lost against the Stormers. So given again the fact that this is in South Africa and how well the Lions have done out of the games in South Africa, I can only see one winner for this, and I'm predicting a Lions win. Okay, on to the next game then, and that is DHL Stormers versus Edinburgh. This is a 5 p.m. kickoff, again, Ireland, UK time. So it's at DHL Stadium. And yeah, when we look at this, you got the Stormers currently 2nd in the league, Edinburgh down at 13th. Again, Edinburgh, one of those teams that you feel like they've got to win this weekend to give themselves some kind of momentum to potentially make a run for the playoffs. Normally, we do have one team that makes a late run to the playoffs, but it normally starts with a win kind of coming out of the blue. So Edinburgh winning against the Stormers, would be, going down to Cape Town and winning there would certainly qualify as being out of the blue. Especially given the Stormers have had a bit of resurgence lately. They were top of the league for so long, unbeaten, and then they dropped down the league, and now they've climbed their way back up with a couple of wins. And they won't want to give up a top 2 spot. They want to keep Ulster, Leinster, etc. At bay, by just keep on winning and potentially put pressure on Glasgow as well. In terms of form, then Stormers won 4 of the last 7, Edinburgh just 2 over the last 7. So Stormers wins against the Lions, and then the Bulls then had a 3-game losing streak. So the Sharks back to back, like 2 games they lose against them, then they lose against the Lions, then they beat the Bulls, and they beat the Dragons. Edinburgh lost against Glasgow, then they beat Benetton, then losses against the Bulls and Leinster, then they beat Scarlets, then losses against Ulster and the Lions, and now they're going to the Stormers and looking to pick something up there. I honestly can't see it. The frustrating thing about Edinburgh, but you could say it with a lot of teams in this league, really, is there's plenty of talent there, but they generally, so often they don't turn up, and because of that, then the opposition, can take the win. And for years they've been inconsistent. Last year, though, in fairness, they got themselves up to 8th place. And I feel like they're taking a step backwards this year in the URC. And yeah, I don't really see them being the team that's going to make that run to the playoffs. Again, if they do get a win against the Stormers, obviously opinion's going to change after that then, because that's going to massively boost their confidence and could spark a run that takes them there. But it's going to take something like that really to spark it for them. So for this one, I'm predicting a Stormers win. Next then, the final game of the weekend. So Zebre Parma versus Ulster. This one was the 7:45 kickoff on Saturday. It's at Stadio Sergio Lanfranchi. And yeah, looking at this, you've got Zebre 16th at the table, Ulster 3rd. So this is the matchup of the weekend with the biggest disparity between the league positions of the two teams. And Zebre certainly at home can have shown that they can cause upsets, but it's been a long time in the URC since they've done that. We look at the form, they lost their last 7 on the bounce. They've actually lost the last 11 on the bounce. So they won the first 2 games of the season, and since then it's just been L's all the way for them. Ulster, by contrast, they've won 4 of their last 7, but they have been in a bit of patchy form lately, and it's kind of come at maybe a bad time for them compared to how other teams in the league are going, because they could have, as I said, been that team that was second, and instead of the Stormers being the ones putting the pressure on Glasgow. You feel now, that if they don't start getting results now, that rather than being up there in the top 4, they could slip down to maybe 6th or 7th in the league, because it's so tight at the minute. And, rather than fighting for potentially home semi-final, they could actually be fending teams off just to make the playoffs. So this feels like, again, a big important game for them. Looking at Zebre's form, for much of the season in the URC, you would expect an Ulster win, but teams like Zebre, they don't win that often, but when they win, normally it is kind of against the odds. So we'll have to see what happens in this. But if we look at the sequence, so Zebre said they've lost 11 on the bounce, but in the last 7, obviously lost all those as well. So they lost back-to-back games against Benetton. Then they lose against Glasgow, back-to-back as well. Then they lose to Connacht, lose to Munster, and they lost to Scarlets last time out. Ulster then wins against Connacht and in Munster. Then they lose to Scarlets. They beat Cardiff, lose to Ospreys, beat Edinburgh, and then they lose to Connacht. So it feels like they are due a win. They have been, in decent form. They should have a lot of those players as well who performed so well for, Ireland in the Six Nations back as well. So, the likes of McCluskey, Balakoon, Stockdale, Timoney, all coming back. And that should make, a big difference for them. Unfortunately, I'm not sure. I don't think we're going to see Cormac Izuchukwu after, what happened to him a couple of weeks ago. That was against Edinburgh, right? But yeah, they should have, a lot of really good players back for them. And it feels like, Murphy has to go. He has to pick them really for this game. There would certainly be a temptation to maybe give those players an extra week's rest, but I don't think that would be the right thing to do. I think, players, it's kind of a balancing act, right? Do you want your players to be fresh? Because the window of being fresh is actually very narrow before it becomes rusty. And I think, 2 weeks without a game certainly could be tipping on to rusty, because then if you're looking at the next game, it's actually 3 weeks. So yeah, I think Ulster will pick a decently strong team for this, and they should take out the win. And yeah, that's the predictions for the weekend. As you can see, there's a lot of teams still jostling for positions at the top of the table and also to get into the playoffs. But as I said at the start of the video as well, you look at those teams, the likes of your Edinburghs, your Scarlets, your Dragons, and it feels like, a loss now, and you can pretty much write them off in terms of even if they go on a run for making the playoffs.